She weighed 88 pounds. When the war ended, not because she was dieting, not because of Hollywood pressure, because she had spent years surviving on tulip bulbs, grass, and whatever scraps she could find in the ruins of a country that had been starved deliberately by an occupying army. The woman the world would one day call the most beautiful actress who ever lived had once been a hollow-eyed child, crawling through wartime Holland, hoping to find something, anything, to stay alive. And here is the part that will stop you cold. Every time she stepped in front of a camera, in those elegant gowns, with that impossibly graceful posture and those enormous dark eyes, she was carrying the memory of every child she had watched die around her. This is the real story of Audrey Hepburn, not the movie star, the survivor. She was born Audrey Kathleen Ruston on May 4, 1929, in Brussels, Belgium. Her father, Joseph Ruston, was a British banker. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, was a Dutch baroness. On paper, it looked like the beginning of a fairy tale, but the fairy tale had cracks in it from the very start. When Audrey was just 6 years old, her father walked out. He simply left. One morning, Joseph Ruston kissed his daughter, walked out the front door, and never came back. Audrey would later say that the loss of her father was the most painful wound of her entire life. She spent decades trying to understand why he had left. She spent even longer trying to forgive him. In later years, when she was the most famous woman in Hollywood, she actually tracked him down. He was elderly and alone, in a care home in Dublin. She paid for his care until he died. She visited him regularly. She could have ignored him. She had every reason to. But Audrey Hepburn was not built for bitterness. After her father left, her mother took her to England to attend a boarding school in Kent. The plan was stability. The plan was structure. Then, in 1939, Adolf Hitler's armies began their march across Europe, and every plan fell apart. Audrey's mother decided the safest place for her daughter was with family in the Netherlands. Holland, as a neutral country, would surely be left alone. That decision, made in love and desperation, placed 10-year-old Audrey Hepburn directly in the path of one of the darkest episodes in modern European history. On May 10, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. Within 5 days, the country had surrendered, and the life Audrey had known was gone forever. She later changed her name, not to hide from fame, but to hide from danger. Audrey Ruston became Etta van Heemstra because a British-sounding name in Nazi-occupied Holland was a death sentence. Think about that for a moment. She was 10 years old, and she was already learning how to disappear. The occupation of the Netherlands was brutal. Jewish families were rounded up and transported to death camps. Resistance fighters were executed in the streets. And from 1944 to 1945, the Nazis deliberately cut off food supplies to the Western Netherlands in retaliation for Dutch railway workers going on strike to support the Allied liberation. What followed was called the Homewinter, the Hunger Winter. Over 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death. Audrey was in the middle of it. She would later describe digging through frozen fields, searching for anything edible. She watched neighbors collapse from malnutrition. She attended performances of ballet with music played at reduced volume so the sound would not attract soldiers outside. And she danced, even then, even in the middle of the horror, she danced. Because one thing the war could not take from her was the way her body moved when music played. She had been studying ballet since she was a small child, first in Brussels, then in Arnhem, Netherlands. Her teacher during the occupation was a woman named Vinja Marova, who risked her own safety to continue classes quietly, in secret, because she understood that art was the only thing keeping these children sane. Audrey was gifted, extraordinarily gifted. But there was a problem. The starvation had damaged her body in ways that could not be undone. She developed anemia. She suffered from jaundice. Her feet, the most important tools of a ballet dancer, had been affected. And she was too tall, with limbs that had grown unevenly during years of malnutrition. Her first ballet teacher in London after the war told her plainly that she would never be a great ballerina. Most people, hearing those words after everything she had already survived, would have broken entirely. Audrey Hepburn looked for another door. When the war finally ended in 1945, she was 16 years old, weighing 88 pounds, and carrying damage to her body that would cause health problems for decades. Her mother moved the family to Amsterdam, then eventually to London, where Audrey began rebuilding her life, piece by piece. She took ballet lessons from the legendary Marie Rambert. She modeled. She performed in small stage productions. She took any job that kept her close to performing, because performing was the only language she had ever completely trusted. She appeared in bit parts in films. She spoke a few lines here. She stood in the background there. She was, as far as the industry was concerned, a pretty girl with good posture and an unusual face. That unusual face, the enormous eyes, the wide cheekbones, the thin neck, the gap between her front teeth. By every conventional standard of 1950s beauty, Audrey Hepburn should not have been a movie star. She was not the bombshell. She was not the blonde. She was not the kind of woman who fit neatly into the categories Hollywood had built for women. She was something entirely different. And then something happened that changed everything. In 1951, Audrey was in Monte Carlo, filming a small part in a forgettable movie called Monte Carlo Baby. Also staying in the same hotel was Colette, the legendary French novelist. Colette was 80 years old, sharp as a blade, and had been searching for months for the right actress to play the lead role in a Broadway adaptation of her famous story, Gigi. When she saw Audrey walk across the hotel lobby, Colette reportedly stood up, pointed directly at her, and said, "There is our Gigi." Just like that. An 80-year-old French novelist watching a 22-year-old girl cross a hotel lobby made a decision that would change the course of film history. Gigi opened on Broadway in 1951. It was a triumph. Audrey Hepburn was a revelation, and Hollywood came calling. What followed was one of the most extraordinary ascents in the history of cinema. In 1953, she starred in Roman Holiday alongside Gregory Peck. She played a princess who sneaks away from her royal duties to experience ordinary life for one single day. The role required her to be charming, funny, vulnerable, and heartbreaking, sometimes within the same scene. She was 23 years old. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress, her very first leading role in a major Hollywood film, and she won the Oscar. Gregory Peck, a veteran actor who had seen everything Hollywood had to offer, said after working with her that she had a quality he had never encountered before. "She makes you feel," he said, "as if she is sharing something real with you. Something private, something that belongs only to that moment." What nobody on that film set knew was how true that was. Everything Audrey Hepburn put on screen was real. The vulnerability was real. The longing for ordinary happiness was real. The deep sadness behind the luminous eyes was real. She was not performing a princess escaping royal life. She was a girl who had spent years trapped inside a war, finally free, finally alive, finally able to be young. Over the following decade, she became something the film industry had never quite seen. She made Sabrina in 1954, War and Peace in 1956, Love in the Afternoon in 1957, Funny Face in 1957. She worked with the greatest directors of her generation. She collaborated with Hubert de Givenchy, the fashion designer, who would become her closest creative partner and one of her most loyal friends for life. Givenchy designed her clothes not for a fashion mannequin, but for a specific woman with a specific history, a woman whose body had been shaped by wartime hunger and whose bones showed in ways that conventional fashion tried to hide. He did not hide them. He celebrated them, and in doing so, he and Audrey together created a visual language of elegance that the entire world recognized instantly. But there was a darkness beneath the glitter. In 1954, she married Mel Ferrer, an actor and director. It was a marriage that would last 13 years, and by most accounts, from those close to them, it was not a happy one. Ferrer was controlling. He involved himself heavily in Audrey's career choices, insisting on projects that suited his own ambitions rather than hers. There were reports of jealousy, of manipulation, of a woman slowly being diminished by the person who was supposed to support her. And then there were the pregnancies. Audrey desperately wanted children. She had miscarriage after miscarriage, 5 in total. Each one left her devastated, in ways she rarely spoke about publicly. The damage done by wartime starvation to her body never truly healed, and the miscarriages were, at least in part, a consequence of those years of malnutrition. She finally had a son, Sean, born in 1960. She said he was the greatest gift of her entire life. But the marriage continued to deteriorate, and in 1968, it ended. She married again that same year, an Italian psychiatrist named Andrea Dotti, and for a brief window of time, she stepped away from Hollywood almost completely, retreating to a farm in Switzerland, raising her children, gardening, cooking, trying to become the version of herself that the war had interrupted. She had another son with Dotti, Luca, born in 1970. That marriage also ended in 1982. And Audrey Hepburn, at 53 years old, found herself beginning again. But this time, what she built was entirely her own. In 1988, she became a goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. She had not taken the role for publicity. She had not taken it to revitalize her image. She had taken it because when UNICEF asked if she would go to Ethiopia, to Somalia, to Bangladesh, to Sudan, to look at starving children and advocate for them, she said yes, instantly, because she had been that child. She knew exactly what those hollow eyes meant. She knew the particular silence of a child who has been hungry for too long. She knew the way the body begins to turn on itself, consuming muscle and tissue in desperate search of fuel. She had lived it. And so she went. The images from her UNICEF work are among the most striking photographs taken of any celebrity in the 20th century. Audrey Hepburn, in her 60s, sitting in the dust of a refugee camp, holding a small Ethiopian child with enormous dark eyes. Both of them looking at each other as if they recognized something. As if they had both survived the same storm. She traveled to 30 countries over 5 years. She slept in difficult conditions. She ate whatever was available. She walked into places where other celebrities sent only their donations. Her UNICEF colleague, Robert Wolders, who was also her companion in her final years, said that when she was in those villages, she never once performed. She never posed. She sat in the dirt with children and held them and talked to them, as if nothing in the world mattered more than that specific child in that specific moment. She was not doing charity, he said. She was doing penance. And she was doing love. In 1992, Audrey Hepburn began to feel unwell. She was in Somalia when the abdominal pain became severe enough that she could no longer ignore it. She returned home to her farm in Switzerland, Tolochenaz, surrounded by the roses she had tended for years, and the dogs she loved, and the quiet life she had always dreamed of when she was a hungry child dancing in secret in occupied Holland. She was diagnosed with appendiceal cancer, a rare form of cancer in the appendix that had spread through her abdominal cavity. She underwent surgery in California. The surgeons told her the cancer had spread too far to be removed completely. She came home to Switzerland. She spent her final weeks in her garden. On January 20th, 1993, Audrey Hepburn died at her home, surrounded by the people she loved, in the place she had chosen as her own. She was 63 years old. The tributes that poured in from around the world were extraordinary, but the one that perhaps captures her best came from a small girl in Somalia who had never heard of Roman holiday or breakfast at Tiffany's or the Academy Award, who simply knew that a woman with kind eyes had sat with her in the dust and held her hand, and made her feel for a moment that she mattered. In her will, Audrey asked that her funeral be simple. She was buried in the village cemetery in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, beneath a simple headstone, surrounded by the Swiss countryside she had made her home. No grand Hollywood ceremony, no red carpet send-off, just the earth and the quiet and the roses. There is a quote she gave in an interview near the end of her life that tells you everything you need to know about who she really was. Someone asked her about her elegance, about how she always seemed so effortlessly beautiful and composed. And she smiled and said, "For beautiful eyes, look for the good in others. For beautiful lips, speak only words of kindness. And for poise, walk with the knowledge that you are never alone." A woman who had spent years of her childhood utterly alone, hungry and afraid, in a country swallowed by war, had found a way to teach herself that the antidote to loneliness was not fame or beauty or success. It was choosing to see the good in others, even when the world gave you every reason not to. She had been shaped by the worst thing that can happen to a child, and she had turned that shaping into grace. Not the Hollywood kind, the real kind. The kind that costs something. The kind that comes from having been broken and choosing every single day not to let the breaking define you. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to ChronosX Secrets for more untold stories that changed the world.